For novelist Gish Jen, expressive writing satisfies a need to share and explore her deepest emotions.
In every good piece of writing, you should feel that the author is grabbing you by the lapels and saying, listen to me, listen to me. In the process of writing, I often check myself to see whether I'm writing on a nerve. And that means that my writing is deeply personal in the sense that always the emotional current is something which is very, very deep in me. If you're not writing on that kind of nerve, your writing is not going to have that quality, you know?
Gish Jen feels that the writing process helps writers discover who they are.
You will discover things writing that not only you wouldn't tell a friend, but that you hadn't even told yourself, you know? Annie Dillard used to say, you know, you are a secret from yourself, and it's true, you know? And one of the things that you do by writing is to sort of uncover some of those secrets.
Gish Jen believes that writing involves more than putting words on paper. It's an ongoing process of gathering experiences to write about.
Writing is a constant job. You don't just write when you're at your computer. You write all day at some level, in the sense that if you're not actually writing, you're gathering material, you're watching. A teacher of mine used to say that everything in writing comes from the sidewalk. And that's true, you know, you've got to walk along the sidewalk, you've got to be keeping your eye out as you're walking, you've got to see everything.
Jen records her experiences and observations in photographs, on audio tape, and on note cards. She uses these notes for writing ideas.
I carry a little 4x6 spiral notebook that has note cards in it. You can actually just rip these note cards out. And whenever I see something, or if I have a strong experience of some kind, or if something occurs to me, I write it down on my card, and then I take all these cards, I rip them all out, and I put them in a note file. And I have all those things to look at and draw on when I'm thinking about writing. Then comes the time when you have it all down on note cards, and you think, well, maybe I wonder if I can make some writing out of this.
Once Jen is ready to begin drafting, she feels it's crucial to sit at her desk, remove all distractions, and write.
A teacher of mine used to say, if you're not sitting at your desk, you cannot be brushed by the wings of inspiration, you know? You cannot wait until you're inspired and then sit down. You sit down and wait to be inspired. I mean, I used to have an exercise where literally, before I started, I would sit at my desk and I would mentally remove people from my office. I would take my mother, I would put her out in the hall. I would take my father, put him out in the hall, take all my siblings, my agent, my editor, my husband, everybody, you know, all my friends, until I was alone with that computer and I was going to say what I had to say, and I was not going to think about any of their opinions.
Once Jen finishes a draft, she must revise it so that others will be able to share her experiences.
Rewriting is writing, people say. We've all had that experience. The first time you say something, it's not what you mean at all. You know, the 20th time you say it, you say what you mean. Now that you know what you mean, the question is, can you say it in a way that other people will understand what you mean?
One way to revise your writing is to ask others to help you edit your work. Jen recognizes that although it is difficult to hear criticism, it's also important.
Every writer has trouble with criticism, but there's a way in which you have to know why you're seeking this criticism, and you have to know what you're going to do with it. You're going to have to know how it's going to benefit you and your work. One thing I found over the years, though, is you might think about simply writing everything down that's said to you. So writing gives you something to do, so you're not just listening, paralyzed. You're doing something. And then also, you have a record later of what the person actually said. Because often when the person is talking to you, you're so upset that you're not hearing very well. This way, you know what they really said. And the same way you sort through your notes, you can sort through the criticism. You can sort of say, oh, 3 people have said this to me before. Maybe this one is right. I better highlight that one.
Gish Jen recognizes that using personal experiences as well as experiences of those around her makes her writing stronger.
And that's another wonderful thing about writing, is that once you start, kind of looking at the world this way, you feel connected to everybody, and you understand that all of those millions of stories around you have a bearing on your story. That the more you understand about that connection, the better your work will be. The great challenges of every writer is to develop his or her own voice. And discovering your voice is like discovering yourself, your best self. So that your writing voice will probably be something like your speaking voice, but your speaking voice when you are at your best. So that it will be the voice that you have after doing all your reading, after doing all your thinking, after doing all your study. The voice that you have then, when you're fresh from all of that, that is your writing voice. The way that I work is I try to write as fast as possible. I try to get by all those internal censors. A friend of mine used to say, good writing is dangerous writing. You are trying to write down the things that are hidden even from yourself. You're trying to get to that unconscious layer. And to do that, you've got to go very fast. Go very, very fast, try to sneak on by, try to not think about it too much.
Because
Descriptive writing captures sights, sounds, tastes, smells, and physical sensations. Restaurant reviewer Rosie McNulty uses descriptive writing so that her readers can experience what a restaurant and its food are like.
descriptive writing is, of course, the main kind of writing that any restaurant reviewer has to do, because the reader is not in the restaurant, and it's your job as a writer to write something that is so vivid and so detailed and so specific and so original and so interesting that without ever budging from his armchair, the reader will feel as if he has been to this restaurant, or that he has had the same wonderful experience you have had without even tasting a thing. I never enjoyed life so much until I started to write about it. With writing, you keep growing.
Rosie McNulty has written more than 100 reviews of over 500 dishes in her writing career. When she goes to a restaurant, she takes several of her friends along. That way, she can try out different dishes without letting the restaurant workers know she's writing a review. During the meal, she takes careful notes.
I would make a note of that mushrooms in the chili, because that's pretty unusual.
Taking notes is difficult because I have to concentrate on the food, the conversation at the table with other diners, because I'll often ask them their opinions about what they're eating. You have to strike a balance between being present to observe what's happening and taking a few minutes to step back and jot notes down. And you have to write sentences that are long enough so that you'll be able to understand them when you get back home. You may jot down a word or two and then ask yourself, what did I mean by this word sprinkle?
Once McNulty begins to write a review, the biggest challenge she faces is to find the right words to describe different eating sensations.
When I first started being a restaurant reviewer, everything was good. And I realized you can't describe 5 dishes as good. And so I'd have to think of better words to use. It's very difficult to come up with just the right word to describe taste and smell. And of course, it's essential, because that's why people are reading this column. They don't so much want to know how the food looks. They want to know, how did it taste? And first you have your usual battery of level A words. It was good, it was bad, it was delicious, it was horrible. But then you have to get a little bit more interesting and expand your vocabulary. It was inspiring, it was memorable, it was deeply satisfying. And even those phrases by themselves grow stale after a while, so you might want to bring in the context. You might want to say, on a cold winter night, there's nothing more satisfying than a bowl of Arturo's vegetarian chili. And that's more interesting than just saying the vegetarian chili was deeply satisfying. Setting the context of a cold winter night makes it a little bit more exciting.
McNulty isn't very fussy about her first draft, but once she gets it down on paper, she'll rework that draft as many as 15 times before she's satisfied with it.
thousands of people read what I write, so I can't just dash it off and I can't just be satisfied with a first and second draft. I look to see if I've repeated even a single adjective. If you want to see how hard it is to write a restaurant review, write an essay and then go back and see if you used any adjective more than once. You've probably used the same adjective 5 or 6 times. Try to replace it each time with a new adjective. I know now to look for certain problems. Have I written too many of the same kinds of sentences? For example, will I have a declarative sentence 5 times in a row? If I've used too many sentences that sound alike, I may want to turn one into a question, maybe break it up and give it a little bit more of a rhythm. And I also will give my drafts to people to read, because when you're a writer, you get so intense and focused on what you're trying to express. One of the best ways of knowing whether you're successful or not is to give it to a reader who's never been to the restaurant. And I just say, are you interested? Did it make you want to eat there? And if they say yes, then I know it's a successful draft.
For McNulty, the best thing about writing, descriptive writing in particular, is that it makes her much more aware of her surroundings.
One of the things I always realize is that when I go someplace, whether I'm physically carrying a pad and pencil or not, I'm always wondering, why is this way? And I'm looking for detail and I'm observing. And that's the greatest thing about being a writer. It's living a more enriched life because you're always picking up so many details. To be a writer is to be an observer. With writer's block, I find the best way to get out of it is to go back to that central feeling that I felt at the restaurant. While I'm at my desk in front of my computer, I try to just close my eyes and concentrate very hard on how I felt in the restaurant and imagine what I saw, and then start to describe it and not think about what the teacher wants, what the instructions are, what words are grammatically correct or not. The best way to write anything is to be very in touch with the experience in your mind and in your heart. I do organize my reviews, and I basically write my reviews chronologically, which means I'll start with an introduction to sort of set the mood and the general theme. My next few paragraphs will basically be a chronological replay of the meal. Other writers just let the theme of what they're writing about dictate the order. They might be moving from foods that are spicy to foods that are bland.
Narration, or storytelling, is as old as the human race. Whether told in conversation, through pictures, or in writing, stories remain a popular form of entertainment. For novelist Rudolfo Anaya, they reveal much about life.
All storytelling has a purpose. It's to communicate our ideas. It's to communicate what we think of human nature. So really, when we write a story, our main character is going to contribute to our knowledge of ourselves. So stories have a very definite purpose. People sometimes think that storytelling is a time in our life that we go sit in a certain room and tell a story or write a story, but it's not. Storytelling goes on all day long.
Rudolfo Anaya has lived all his life in New Mexico, in a community with a strong history of storytelling that he is now passing on to his granddaughter, Kristen.
That oral tradition that is very much alive in New Mexico, I think, was very formative for me. It told me that anyone can tell a story, and that stories can change from one night to the next, and you can embellish, and you can create new characters, and you can change the plot, and there's something magical in all of that. I think what we want to do when we sit down to write is to create that main character that will be affected by the conflict that we set up in the story. I hike up here just to contemplate. Because conflict is critical to human nature. We all have conflicts. whether it's the smallest one, you know, what do I wear today? Or am I going to pass my test? Every character has to come with a conflict. The character may come to you in the beginning and be interesting, but writing takes a lot of work, and therefore developing more and more of that character takes work. So essentially, part of writing becomes digging deeper and deeper into the character. I think it's a very good idea to, when you start developing your character, to put the character in a scene and say, what would the character do if he met a dinosaur or he met Batman? The background of the character, wherever the character lives, is very important to me. In New Mexico, I use the sky and the environment and the mountains and the desert as part of the setting, which really help form the character. And again, the advice I would give you would be, make that scene something that you really know, a scene you know in your home, in school, or a place you really know, because you'll be able to describe it better and you'll be able to show how it affects your characters.
After developing characters, setting, and plot, Anaya begins drafting his narratives.
I call it a hurried-through draft. You don't stop to choose your words. What I try to do is just write the story out. Go for it. I don't care if it's 15 pages or 500. I try to get that first draft down. Then obviously what's going to happen is a lot of that material I don't need, or it's not appropriate, or it doesn't fit, and that has to be cut. It's after you finish the first draft and you sit down to revise it that you begin to choose better words.
You have too much description in the very beginning.
All right.
Anaya consults his wife before revising. Together, they'll rework his story dozens of times.
I think the process of revision is very crucial to writing.
So work on him.
There is no first draft masterpiece. You've got to get that in your mind and say, if I'm going to write, I have to do it over and over and over again. And what do you look for when you revise? Everything, you know. You develop your character more. You develop the dialogue, develop the description. Every element that there is in fiction, including grammar, things like periods and commas, get refined. So revision is a process of refining, and you take the story to the best possible place it can be, and then you're done with it. The one tip I would give you would be to stay away from very passive verbs. We sometimes fall into that trap and the verbs become very lazy. Decide what it is you want to convey with each sentence. What do you really want to tell the reader? In a very concrete way, in a very simple way, in a very straightforward way, and then go for that. I think the best advice to give young storytellers, young writers, is to jump in. Don't worry about where the story will go, how it will end. Just get the main idea of it and get your character and jump in and start describing that character. Once you describe the character, then you're halfway there, because the character will most often turn around and tell his or her own story. They'll lead you into the story.
The news never stops. Important events happen around the world and around the clock. As national correspondent for a major network news show, Gary Matsumoto uses expository writing to bring the news into our homes.
Some things in Macomb haven't changed.
Since there is so much news to report, he summarizes the information and reports only the facts.
Television is a visual medium, But we cannot put pictures on a screen without words and expect to have a story that people are going to follow. It needs structure. And that's where writing comes in. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in terms of script, it's really a case of less is more. Summarizing is a critical part of what we do. Your average news story on a nightly news show is 90 seconds long. You have to make decisions about which facts that you include and which you exclude. You just have to make sure the basics are covered. Who, what, where, when, and how.
Once Matsumoto is assigned a news story, he begins to gather information about the topic.
One must never underestimate the value of preparation. And the very best stories that we do, we often spend 3 to 4 weeks preparing, doing research, gathering facts, making phone calls, choosing who we're going to interview before we actually schedule time in the field with a camera crew.
Gary Matsumoto has just finished filming a story about the 30th anniversary of Freedom Summer 1964, when civil rights activists went to Mississippi to register African Americans to vote. His first step in writing the script is to find a focus.
To go to Bergland, which is very much a segregated neighborhood. In order to narrow this down to make it more accessible for an audience, it's generally a good idea to look for a person or a single event that will tell the larger story, the small story that tells the larger one. So in our case, we chose to profile a city called Macomb. In deciding how much background information to use, say for instance in the piece on Freedom Summer that we're doing, you have to simply determine how much background information is necessary in order to make it clear why you're doing the story in the first place. If we just went back to Macomb and didn't explain that this was the place that people called the bombing capital of the South in 1964, then our audience is going to be left scratching its head and saying, why did they go there? Why bother? You can't cram too much into 4 minutes or 90 seconds, but you have to have a sufficient amount of background information to make it clear why you're doing the story.
Jeff, can you pick up on 7, please?
When preparing a first draft of his news story, Matsumoto arranges his details in an order that will keep the attention of his audience.
You have to ask yourself, what is the most interesting, most arresting, most engaging video? We're showing basically with these pictures that nothing's changed in 30 years. Because that's what you want to open with. You want to grab your viewer right away. Then, somewhere around the middle, you've got to think, what element of surprise can I offer? And something that will be a nice little kicker line at the end.
After he finishes the first draft of a news story, Matsumoto begins revising.
I had a mentor who was the director of radio news for Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And he always said, the best writing is rewriting. This boss of mine, he won the highest broadcast awards in America several times over, was still rewriting a 30-second radio script 3 or 4 times after 30 years in the business. You can always go back and make it better. When you revise, you don't want to bore people. Try and be interesting. Writers will often have to cut out their favorite lines. As much as he or she wants to get that line of script in there because it's clever, sometimes it just clangs. You just gotta cut. You have to be ruthless.
For Matsumoto, the expository writing process can be boiled down to the following.
You have to decide what is fair and what is honest, and what is essential. Those are the 3 questions you have to ask yourself. The only way to make intelligent choices about what facts to include is to think and ask yourself questions. What is important and why? You can't include every single fact because you'll never finish your story. So ask yourself these questions. Why do I care? Why would she care? Who cares? It helps to have someone else look at your script because it's another pair of eyes. It's another set of sensibilities. and they can see something that perhaps you didn't see, or think of something that you didn't think, and they can make a contribution. So never be defensive when someone criticizes a script or makes suggestions, because very often that person can make it better.
Exposition is writing that explains, informs, or presents information. Bruce Brooks uses expository writing to cover a range of subjects from birds to basketball.
One of the great things about being a writer is that you have the excuse to be interested in a lot of different things. I get to be as intricately curious about animals, or about the way trees grow, or about what makes the depth of the sky look different in one weather condition from another, or how one masters the art of dribbling a basketball. But I get to then have the excuse, because I'm writing a book about it, of going into great detail, learning all these things, talking to a lot of interesting people who know a great deal about these matters, and then finding good ways of putting it together so that people who read the books can understand and be just as interested.
Bruce Brooks writes both fiction and nonfiction. He started with novels, but his fascination with the natural world around him and his inability to find books to satisfy this curiosity led him into expository writing.
I think curiosity is a writer's greatest tool. In my case, I've been very curious all my life about the natural world. I was always a real nature spy as a kid. I seemed to always be finding myself alone in woods somewhere, finding great stuff. And everything I find makes me curious, so I allow that curiosity to turn into ideas. It's still the same now. I still take those walks. My son and I take them together all the time, and it turns into books.
Once Brooks has a topic, he gathers as much information as he can. Then he begins to write.
I like to write for 7, 8, 9 hours every day when I'm in the writing phase of a project. I can't sit around and say, am I inspired right now? I don't know. The inspiration isn't quite where I want it to be. I sit down, I start writing, and the inspiration comes, because my momentum is one that builds up in a really regular way.
As he writes his first draft, Brooks isn't very selective about how much information he presents.
I will have, in one chapter on camouflage, I will know the stories of 61 different animals that use camouflage. All of them are intriguing. All of them are wonderful. All of them have something to say as far as the points I want to make in the chapter go. What do I put in and what do I leave out? I usually start by putting in too much. And then I leave my first draft bulging with information, and I go away from it for a while, and I come back and I read it and I say, wow, this is all great, but there's just too much in here.
As Brooks revises his work, he thinks in terms of creating a path for his readers to follow. The information he includes should lead the reader forward.
I will put a bend in my reader's path and say, no, there's too much there. I make him go in too big a circle, and I will take some of that information out and let him go in a straighter movement there between 2 points that I've made. Revising is something that I regard really as a privilege. It's a great opportunity to be able to go back and fix that stuff. Why should anybody be crabby about having the right to fix something that isn't working? It's tedious sometimes, but for me, it's really fun. That's the part I enjoy the most, to tell you the truth. I had a friend in college who was a basketball player, and he used to say to me, I envy you, your ability to revise. Because if I'm in a basketball game and I miss a jump shot, that opportunity is gone. It bangs off the rim, the other team gets the rebound, comes down, scores. That's it. That's a 4-point swing. He said, when you make a mistake, you get to fix it. And I think that's what revision should be regarded as, the chance to fix mistakes before they really happen.
Writing gives Brooks the opportunity to explore different interests.
One of the things that I enjoy most about my life and my job is the fact that I do get to choose all different kinds of projects. I do not have to go to work and do the same thing every day. My favorite comment that I get from people often is the comment that they're surprised to see that the person who wrote my most recent book is the same person who wrote the previous one. And that's something I enjoy about my kind of writing. What I use to inspire myself for revision is simply the process of reading what I've written in an earlier draft and seeing if it creates the effects that I know I wanted to create in a reader. I read it as a reader, not as a writer. I go through and I'll read a scene that I wanted to be funny, and maybe it isn't as funny as I wanted it to be. So I make a note to myself, you know, no, this isn't good enough, let's make this funny. I feel it's important to have a good sense of your reader or of people whom you're reaching, because you need to always know how much you need to give them, what will interest them, what is likely to lead them into this feeling or that feeling. It's my job as a writer to make my audience interested in what I'm writing about. I think if kids simply begin to be a little tiny bit more aware of their own curiosity, they will realize they have tons of ideas. They are always asking themselves, well, what if this had happened? You know, what if instead of missing the 2 foul shots at the end of the game last night, what if I'd made those foul shots? How would everybody feel about me? What would I feel about myself this morning? Would I feel different? That'd be interesting. That's a story right there.
The sailboat Clearwater is an environmental classroom on the waters of the Hudson River.
See, the pelvic fin is behind the gill, and there's a pectoral fin underneath it.
It takes money to keep the sloop sailing, and as director of development, it's Kate Mitchell's job to raise that money. She uses persuasive writing to accomplish her goal.
When you're writing persuasively, the #1 rule is to believe what you're saying. I try to persuade people, first of all, to work with us to clean up the Hudson River and to educate youth about the river and the importance of the ecosystem.
Plankton. They're so small that I could put 1,000 between my fingers and you wouldn't see them.
Because if my writing doesn't work, then my organization doesn't get funded, and we don't have the money to continue our programs. The boat has to sail, the boat needs to be repaired, so my writing has to work.
Mitchell feels that knowing your strongest point is a key to writing persuasively.
The boat is the best salesperson for the programs that we have. Getting people on the boat is really important for convincing them, because it's a very experiential program. And so that when they have that experience, they can understand much better. So I have to write to them and explain to them and give them some idea of what it will be like.
Mitchell says that her research is an important part of making a persuasive argument.
I cannot sit down and talk about a sailboat and convince people that they should give money to us for our sailing programs if I know absolutely nothing about sailing.
Acid's yellow.
I read books on boats. I know about boats. I'll learn about education. I'll learn about the pollution in the river. I've read about the river itself, the biography of the river, the history of this organization. So I have to do a lot of research, because people are pretty smart and they know a lot, and they'll make sure that you do too.
Oh, you can't see the fish. Well, let's get the fish.
Before they believe anything you say.
Kate, I think you just want to take a look at a couple of these sections here.
Before I do anything else, I want to know basically the general feel of what I'm going to be writing, the order I'm going to be writing it in, and how long I want the piece to be. So I'll sit at the computer and I'll actually just start typing a couple words, and then I'll rearrange the order of the words into an outline, and I'll get some idea of how much I have to say. If you just start writing, if you don't have some kind of structure to write with, then you don't know where you're going, and you spend a lot of time, if you don't have an outline, just sort of flailing around and being lost.
Once she has outlined her argument, Mitchell begins her first draft with a hook.
The hook is what interests somebody. If swimming in the river is going to interest somebody, then the hook is what they don't know. Tell them what they don't know, that the river wasn't swimmable before.
Cool.
You can tell them, for example, that there are 200 native species of fish, original species of fish in the river. They are still here. It's one of the most productive estuaries on the East Coast. But they can't eat them. That's a hook for some people.
Once she has finished her first draft, Mitchell starts revising.
The best tip on revision is that you shouldn't love your first draft so much. It's not the best it's going to be, and you have to be able to let it go and change it. When I was younger, I really hated revision. I thought whatever came out in the beginning was exactly as it should be, and it was right, and you couldn't change that. And I've come to really understand revising is really important, that it's not the first thing that comes out, but it's what they read that matters the most, and that's how you get your point across.
Mitchell feels that good persuasive writing really pays off.
Writing is empowering, and being able to persuade somebody with your writing is one of the most empowering things that you can do. Let somebody help you to revise it, take people's advice, and it's hard, but I've had pieces that I wrote that were sort of mediocre or were edging on being good turned into great papers because somebody helped me edit it. For any kind of persuasive writing, it's important to know who your audience is, because that's what you choose to address, something that matters to them. A lot of the people that I write to, I have folders about, so I will do research on them, and I'll have to know who I'm writing to, and I'll look at who they are, look at what they do, how old they are, and really get an understanding of who is going to be reading what I'm sending them. It's a struggle of whether the same words that I use for one person will really work for another person, so I have to constantly be looking at the language that I'm using and who I'm using it with. It only makes sense to write about something that you know or feel strongly about. To write about something that matters not an iota to you makes absolutely no sense.
The key to writing a good report is to concentrate on research. Research can also play an important role in many other types of writing. Writer Virginia Hamilton uses research not only when she writes biographies and other reports, but also when she writes novels and short stories.
The first thing that I do when I am gathering information for a nonfiction work is to find out all I can about the person I'm writing about. I learn about what they did every day of their lives. I learn the historical period in which the person lived, because you can't just have a person, you know, you have to have the world, the environment in which they live. So I learn all that. I become a person many times of another time, almost the way an actor plays a part, in order to know how to write about that person.
When Virginia Hamilton writes about historic subjects, she starts her work at the library. She looks for books and articles that have been written on her subject.
The first thing I do is go to the library, and I look up the person to find out all of the facts. So I look at all that material, and then I begin to mark places that are important to the way I'm going to do something. I use primary sources, which are actual events that are written down by participants, let's say. In a historical account of a former slave, I had actual documents from the trial where he fought for his freedom in Boston, so I could use the trial transcripts and make my own rendering of the events more accurate, because I had the words of all the people involved in the trial.
The house of Dyes Dreer loomed out of mist and murky sky.
Hamilton says that a great way of getting information is to interview people. She used interviews to research the Underground Railroad, the escape route for slaves, for her historical novel called The House of Dyes Dreer. Hamilton talked with longtime residents of her town to get information about how the railroad worked.
When I was doing the House of Dyes Dreer, I had a wonderful town of people who have lived here for many, many years, whose parents and grandparents were born here. I did interviews of older people to find out about how things were at the turn of the century. You can go to people and places that are there in your community many times and use them in your report. Once I've done all of my research, the process of organizing it is rather slow and painful. And I do this in steps and in parts. It's like trial and error. You try different things about putting the material together. Once you have all of your material in the basic outline of the biography, then you begin to involve this material in a creative process, in a process that will look interesting to the reader. You know, you may not start with a person's birth. You may start with some event in their childhood that was significant to what happened in the rest of their lives. How do you start a report? You really have to sit down and start writing before you really know exactly what you're doing. It's okay to make mistakes. You know, mistakes you cross out and start again. I do that over and over again. I think you should know that revising or rewriting is extremely important. That's the way you really find your story. The story never becomes clear the first time you write it, so you revise and you make it better and better. And I think students should understand that when they write, it doesn't come out perfect. You shouldn't think that. It's never perfect at first. It grows into perfection. So it's a kind of constant revision that's going, bringing the material up. I say it's like being at the bottom of a lake and rising to the top. You want to make things clearer and clearer, and the way to do that is revise, revise, revise.
Although the writing process is hard work, Hamilton likes seeing her ideas become books.
Taking an idea, which you start with, and turning it into a book and taking it clear through the whole publishing process is really quite wonderful, because it's hard. It's not an easy thing to do. And once you have done it, you feel that, I feel that I've really accomplished something. I feel a sense of great satisfaction in my work. If I'm writing a book for an 8-year-old, I automatically know not to use the kinds of words that I would use for a 15 or 16-year-old, you know. So in my younger books, my vocabulary is much softer in many ways. The sentences are shorter. The storyline is less detailed. Once I've chosen a topic for an account or of events or a story, whatever you want to call it, and then try to narrow it and focus it, I have discovered that you can have too many ideas on a given subject, and you must narrow what you're going to do. So usually I focus on an individual that I want to write about, whether it's a real person or a fictional person.
Creative writing blends experience and observation with personal feelings and imagination. Usually, creative writing refers to poetry, drama, and fiction. For Julia Alvarez, it has a broader meaning.
I don't think of creative writing just as poetry and stories and novels. I think of creative writing as any good writing. I think creative writing is a way to understand yourself and what you're going through. I mean, you learn so much through writing. I mean, you learn how you feel about things, but you're also sort of, I guess, making your little statement about things, and that makes you feel a little bit more powerful with what's happening around you.
Alvarez came to this country from the Dominican Republic when she was 10. She spoke no English and had few friends. Writing became her refuge.
Sometimes I say that what happened was that we left the Dominican Republic and I landed not in the United States, but in the English language. That became my new home, the world of the imagination, which you never had to lose because it was a portable homeland. You can carry your world with you wherever you go, and it was something that became for me the place that I lived in my imagination.
Relying on her vivid imagination, Alvarez has developed into a successful poet. She believes strongly in the importance of hard work. She'll spend up to 7 hours a day writing. She also spends much of her free time searching for writing ideas.
Writing doesn't start when you sit down to write. It's happening all the time. When you go outside and you see the way that a blade of grass bends in a breeze, when you're a writer, you're thinking about how that's happening. And sometime when you go to write about something, there's that little blade of grass bending in the breeze, or some little expression you notice on someone's face.
Alvarez records her experiences in a journal, along with passages of poems and stories she's read.
Often I read something, and I'll copy out the whole poem in my journal because I love it, and part of loving it is that I want to sort of write it all down myself. I want to go over each word and each line and write it down, and I have it then in my journal.
Alvarez likes to use these passages and the other material in her journal as an inspiration for her new work. According to Alvarez, a starting point is all that's required to write.
The thing about writing is that one thing leads to another. You know, you start writing about your grandmother's rose bush that she used to have outside her front door. And that gets you started on this dress she would always wear. You know, this big old shirtwaist dress, you know, with little flowers on it. And that would get you started on the day that she bought that. You know, it's one thing leads to another. If you set out thinking, what am I going to write about? You will never, you'll scare yourself.
When she finishes a piece of writing, she puts it aside for a while and involves herself in other things like household chores. Then she returns to her work with a fresh eye and starts to revise. She focuses on each word she's used, making sure that it conveys the exact meaning that she intended.
Angelica, loaded with nutmeg, anise. Emily Dickinson said there's no approximate words in a poem. There's no word that you feel, well, that's good enough. And it's not good enough if that's what you're saying about a word in a poem. It's got to be just the right word. With a hot glide up, then down his shirts, I ironed out my father's back.
She also pays careful attention to sound by reading her poems aloud.
Sometimes it might look all right in paper. You go to read it out loud. It doesn't sound right. And that's another thing, I mean, why it's so important for me to give readings and to go to different places and read something before an audience. Or I read almost everything I write to my husband. I'll read it to him. And it's not just that he can give me feedback, but in saying it out loud, I hear what doesn't work.
Alvarez thoroughly enjoys her work as a writer because she feels it helps her to understand herself and the world around her.
Henry James said that the poet, or the writer, is him on whom nothing is lost. And there's a way in which when you're a writer, you're paying attention to all these little things. It keeps you aware of the life around you, and that's part of what I like.
Julia Alvarez says that poets should give readers a written snapshot of what the poet sees or feels.
The poet is showing you through a little image, through a little photograph, I call it, what that feeling feels like, by showing you what the feeling is, instead of telling you that he's feeling that feeling, or that you should feel that feeling, or making a statement that's not vivid enough or concrete enough so that you can see it, or touch it, or smell it, or feel it. There's nothing like a photograph album to get you started thinking about a certain event in your life, or certain people that were important at that point in your life, what they looked like, what they wore, you know, how they held themselves, all of that. Photographs are wonderful places to get right to the heart of a memory. Sometimes you have to remember, too, that dialogue isn't back and forth like a tennis ball. People don't ask a question and the other person replies to it and the other person responds to it. Sometimes somebody asks a question, somebody makes a remark, or somebody says, yeah, sure, and but their body language is part of the dialogue. So that's sometimes why you say, yeah, sure. She, you know, stood up and walked to the window.
Marilyn Stasio loves shopping for mysteries. As a reviewer of mystery stories for a major metropolitan newspaper, she responds to literature on a regular basis, sharing her enthusiasm for the books she reads.
The pleasure of writing a book review is that you're able to talk to people about the book, because that's the way I see reviewing. It's a conversation. It's as if someone handed me the book and said, I've written this book, tell me what you think about it. And then, of course, the other person that I'm having my conversation with is the reader of my column. I think of that person, that reader, as a friend, and say, here's why you ought to read this book. I love this book, and here are the reasons. Too often, people think that the critic is someone who is always criticizing. But that's not what I do at all. What I do is I love the books, and I respond to the books. And that's what I think a book reviewer is.
The process of writing a book review begins at Stasio's doorstep. Every day she comes home to more books to choose from.
Mysteries are very, very popular. So each month you can have as many as, I would say a minimum of 50 to 150 mysteries coming out. And when I get a chance to look at them, I can decide better whether I feel I might want to review that or not. I want to pick a book I'm going to like, because I want to pick a book that the reader is going to like. And I'd like to be able to recommend it.
Once she's made her choice, she starts reading with an open mind.
I try to pay attention to what the writer is trying to tell me and what the writer is trying to express in the book. Primarily, I would look for a well-told story. It has to have some originality, or why am I reading this? So I would say that the characters have to be very good and very strong.
After a while, Stasio has to make some judgments about what she's reading.
I think that at some point, you're going to make a decision that you like the book or you don't. And at that point, you have to be able to give a reason why. You can't just say, this was a very good book. Why? What did it do? Did it make you think about something? Did it make you feel that you were there?
As a professional critic, Marilyn Stasio has learned to recognize the signs of weak writing.
If there are too many adjectives in a sentence, it's not a good sentence. If I can't understand what I've just read when I finished a chapter, it's not well written. If I get confused about a character and say, who is that character? Did that character just show up out of nowhere? That's not a good character.
When Stasio takes notes, she focuses on capturing the details of the story.
I am very dependent on my notes. I'm very, very careful to write down the exact spelling and the page number so that I can refer to it when I'm reviewing. The second thing that I write down a lot are notes about the quotes. If I'm going to make a point about this book, I often try to make it in the exact words of the author. And the third kind of note I take are really my impressions. If you've taken good notes, the writing is much easier.
Stasio says that getting started is the hardest part of the process.
Oh, every writer just hates that blank page or that empty blue blinking computer screen. I try to take my time and get a good start. Because once I've got a good start, I feel happy about it. And that lets me get on to the next point. And it's wonderful when you can look at one sentence and say, this is a good, good sentence. I can go on from there.
Once she has finished her review, Stasio revises her work.
I'm a stickler about the right word. And I notice that if I use the wrong word, it's just going to jump right off the page and punch me. When I revise, I find that it's impossible to do it if I've just written it. It's impossible. You have to give yourself that overnight, that time to distance yourself from the piece so you can look at it more objectively as an editor might. The process is one of enjoying what you're doing, but at the same time analyzing yourself and the book. And that's a review, whether you're going to write it later or whether you're just going to tell your friend. Consider that the person you're writing the book report for has not read the book. You should write the report as if you were talking to a friend and explaining to them what they were going to find if they read this book.
Sometimes knowing what not to include can make your response to literature stronger.
You shouldn't spend the entire report talking about the story. Just give an idea, basically, of what the story is. Then the characters are important, but you don't have to identify again every last character in the book. It simply isn't necessary.
Anything repeated too many times can be boring. When revising, look for the following problems.
More than anything else, I respect clarity in writing. So it's very tempting to use the same sentence structure all the time because it's the clearest. The subject, the predicate, the object. And it can also be pretty dull. So I'm very careful to refine my work so that I don't constantly use the same sentence structure.
The Cowboys are the measuring stick in the NFL.
Mike Tirico is an anchor person for a major sports cable network. He's responsible for writing all the scripts for his program. He uses practical writing, letters and memos, to gather information for his scripts.
My job goes beyond knowledge of television. It also includes knowledge of writing, knowledge of correct grammar, knowledge of how to communicate with people in an informative sense. There is not one person who works in television or radio or writes at a newspaper or writes stories for a magazine who isn't a good writer. When you're writing for broadcast media, you know that the person at home has one chance to hear it. So it has to be clear, concise, and interesting. For young reporters who are interested in journalism, it's essential to know much more than you write. You always should be able to write more and inform someone more on a story.
Tirico uses practical writing skills that he learned in school, in his broadcasting career. He writes letters requesting information to gather facts for his stories.
My philosophy with a letter in contacting someone is to make it as descriptive and as short as possible. The most effective letters that I've sent to people get to the point quickly, are polite, are clearly stated, and don't take 2 or 3 pages. One of the basic things that they teach are the 5 W's and an H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. If you can encompass those 6 questions into just a letter, that answers anything anyone needs to know why you're requesting information.
Once Tirico has gathered enough information, he tries to find unusual ways to present it.
You always get stuck in writing, especially in television sportscasting, because you can only say so many times that a certain player is great. Michael Jordan may be the best athlete to ever play basketball, but how many times can you say that? So you have to challenge yourself to find new ways to express that to the viewer. Everyone knows Michael Jordan's a great basketball player, but some people don't always know that Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team. That's an anecdote we can pass along.
Do you ever let your emotions get into the game? Like, say you're doing a report on a certain game or a certain sport. Do you ever let your emotions come into your paper? Or?
I think if you write and transmit the emotion that's in the stadium to people...
When Tirico sits down to write, he begins with a piece of information that will grab the viewer's interest.
When I start to sit down and write a 15-second lead-in for a highlight package of the exciting plays of that game today or tonight, I'll try to find some way to hook the viewer.
Did anything happen with the people from the Hotel Washington?
Give them some information, make it of interest, and relate it to tonight's game, so they have a reason to stick around. It's important to finish with the same main idea that you started. And if you don't do that, then you've led people on a wrong track. You have to start and finish, if not the same exact place, in a place where the person at home can make their own conclusion and tie the 2 things together.
After completing his draft, Tirico makes it even better through revision.
Once you've written something and accomplished it, doesn't mean you can't make it better. I find that some of the best things I write are things that I will go back and we call it tweak. Go back and just say, well, if I can change this word or change another couple of words here and there, it may make it more powerful. It may make the story a little more clearly understood by the viewer at home. It may be more significant. It may be more accurate.
Tirico also feels it's important to let someone else review his work to help guide his revision.
You write something and your mind tells you it's right, but you may have not had a grammatically correct sentence. You may have misspelled a word, may have mistyped a name. Whenever you have that second set of eyes to look at it, a set of eyes that you trust, it always helps.
Tirico believes that all the effort he puts into his writing ultimately pays off.
It's a communications field, and the way we communicate is by speaking in the television and broadcast media, and what we speak is what we write. So it all comes back down to writing, and writing with some interest to make it exciting for the people at home. For sportscasting, when I try to write something, I try to add that other word or two that really makes a difference. When you say Michael Jordan brought a crowd to its feet, if you can change that to brought a cheering throng to its feet, all of a sudden you see a lot more people. You can make it more visual, more vivid image. There's a reason in every game for the score. Whether it's an individual player, a key play, a coaching decision, the field conditions, and it's up to you as a reporter to find out that reason, get some background on it, and then transmit it to the viewers or the listeners or the readers at home as to why it contributed to the final result in the game. There is nothing worse than if you want to be a sportscaster, you go out there and say something that's wrong. There's a sports fan at home who loves his or her team, knows his or her team inside out, and if you make a mistake, they'll catch you on it. You have to be 100% sure that what you're saying is true.